Hi dear, Rogoba, Laxovakia, Polina, Grigoreva, everybody, nice to see you. Min Marina, I'm trying to share China last chart. Is it working together? Very nice. Okay. Uh, the last part of an economic history of modern China is basically dealing with modern economic growth under socialism. As you see, socialism started with the Soviet model. So the theory underlying the Soviet model of rapid industrialization was adopted by China in the 1950s, was the Feldman growth model, which had been formulated in the 1920s during the great industrialization debate by Feldman. The development of heavy industries is only the vehicle for the accelerated growth of the downstream downstream consumer goods industry. So always Soviet model started with heavy industries and then trickle down to downstream consumer goods industry. Two sectors in a closed economy. Sector one, investment goods, the sector which makes machines, tools, investment goods. Sector two, consumer goods. Out of those machines, tools, they make consumer goods. So two-sector economy, Feldman growth model has a two-sector economy. Production factors, capital and labor. Capital stock does not depreciate. Rate of change in capital stock equals to total investment. So output of capital goods in sector one is equal to rate of change to total investment. So when you change capital stock, that is total investment equal to total investment. And that is equal to total output. Normally, depreciation D, if we depreciate, apply 20% depreciation rate, then dk/dt plus equals total investment plus dk. So, for example, if investment is 100, total capital stock is 1,000, depreciation rate is 10%, then of course 100 plus 1,000 times 0.1, 10% depreciation rate. We can apply that, and that should be equal to this. Maybe. Okay. So Feldman growth model is very simple model. GY is growth rate of GDP, for example. GYC is consumer goods growth rate. It depends on actually how much is invested, VI. It's a very simple Feldman growth model. As the investment increases, output increases. As the investment in investment good increases, consumer good increases. So this type of very simple Feldman model, rapid capital accumulation, formation, and priority development of heavy industry was emphasized. So China in the early 1950s, you see, as you know, the Chinese history in upper part of 19th century, from 1910 to 19 roughly 40, China was divided into Republican Party, Communist Party. Ultimately, Communist Party consolidated power, internal war. So China did not have any model to develop socialism. They were fighting, they were engaged in internal war, but they didn't know how to build a social revolution, how to build a social economy. The only economy precedented is Soviet Union. So China in the early 1950s initiated the wholesale transplant of Soviet institutions and policy into the country, and in particular, the system of collective agriculture, state enterprises, central planning, the administrative allocation of production factors, the use of price seizures to extract agricultural surplus to finance heavy industrial development, and the adoption of the autarky policy in international economic relations. Why? China didn't have any model. China had to rely on Soviet Union because Soviet Union was the only socialist country. So what was Soviet model? Share of state investments in industry. Look at this. From 1950s, 1970s, heavy industry occupied 47 to 55%. Light industry, very little, less than 10%. So share of state investment in industry, state investment is heavy in heavy industries. Light industry was not that heavy. So Soviet model, usually share of state investment is heavy in heavy industry. So the collectivization of Chinese agriculture was preceded by the land reform of 1949-1952. So collectivization is like Soviet model. Chinese agriculture was preceded by the land reform 1949-1952. Land reform first carried out, and then collectivization of Chinese agriculture was proceeded. Land and other agricultural resources were expropriated from landlords and rich peasants and redistributed to poor and middle income peasants. The major objective of the land reform was political, in that it aimed at consolidating the political base of Chinese Communist Party in rural areas. So getting rid of landlords' power. Any remainder of Republican parties rich landlords' power they wanted to eliminate. Development of collectivization in Chinese agriculture, 1950 to 1958. Percentage of farms covered. So development of collectivization continued to grow from 1950 to 1955. Collectivized farm became dominant. As you can see. In the Maoist era, Agricultural surplus was siphoned off, drained to industrial sector, from farmers to fuel industrialization. So industrialization was priority, not farming welfare. So siphoned off, what that means siphoned off. Any agricultural surplus left over, welfare, was shipped to industrializing sector, was not left over in agriculture. So agriculture became poverty. Collectivized farms became poverty because there was nothing left. Any agricultural surplus was siphoned off, drained to industrial sector, which farmers had to pay under the compulsory agricultural procurement scheme introduced in 1953. From farmers to fuel industrialization in the form of various visible and invisible taxes. So farmers had to pay a lot of taxes, but there was nothing left. Farmers became poorer and poorer. Okay. So the Soviet model, China's 1955 agricultural and industrial outputs and 1967 targets. If we see these targets, for example, grain, 1955 output was 175. 1967 target was 300. Target reached, exceeded in year, only 1978. Okay. For example, electric power, 1955 output was 12.3. 1967 target was only 7.3. So not target reached 1960. So a lot of things were on the 1967 targets. So China was not meeting with targets. Farmers' tax burden. For example, 1952, agricultural tax was 2.7, 1978, 2.8%. Monopolist profit became larger, 12%, 1978. Monopsonist profit even larger by 1978. So farmers' contribution remained the same, but monopolist profit increased sharply. So farmers' life was miserable. Other factors, state enterprises. In the non-agricultural sector, the large formerly nationalist or foreign-owned enterprise became the first state enterprise, SOEs. Central planning, as in the Soviet Union, resource allocation in the Maoist era was through central planning, with the planners' preferences largely determining who produce what, how much, and how. So China follows central planning practice by Soviet Union. Factor allocation and the role of price. Inter-enterprise mobility was severely restricted, as was spatial mobility, which was controlled by the household registration scheme. In other words, household registration scheme means what? Household could not move from one area to another area. Registration scheme locked. Therefore, factor allocation, they could not move job. They could not move from Shanghai to Beijing. Mobility is limited. Control of inflation. China's plan is control the inflation by balancing supply and demand for consumer goods, but always consumer goods was in shortage. Therefore, there was excessive inflation. Supply could not meet with balance because supply was blocked by factor allocation, by transportation bottleneck. They could not supply in the right place, in the right price. Therefore, there is always inflation for consumer goods. China largely followed Soviet model with the collectivization of the economy and its adoption of a system of central planning and resource allocation, as I said, tight control of production, capital and labor, its growth strategy, and its foreign trade. The only major difference was China's faster pace of collectivization of agriculture. Oh, that is, China's collectivization of agriculture was faster. Why? Because Mao's great emphasis on the development of productivity relations in Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution strategy, by which he tried to force the pace of development. In other words, Mao thought if Chinese agricultural sector live alone, do not go through fast collectivization, then Chinese agricultural sector will be source of instability. In other words, anti-Mao movement. So they wanted to make very collectivization fast Chinese farms because Mao thought Chinese farm is not consolidated. His revolution will fail. So that to accelerate that collectivization, Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution, some other unnecessarily hard strategies and movements were followed up. In other words, they wanted to put more hard time on collectivized agricultural farms so that agricultural farm cannot be the source of instability of Chinese revolution. So they forced unnecessarily hard Great Leap Forward movement as a sidestep. Cultural revolution, kind of a philosophical and ideological war, all imposed on Chinese collectivized farms. by which he tried to force the pace of development. Here's 1949, December 16, Moscow, Kirov. First time Mao paid a visit to Moscow, and Moscow acknowledged Mao regime as a second socialist regime, officially. It was only 1949. 1949, as you remember, Republic of Korea was divided into North Korea, Democratic Republic of Korea, and Republic of Korea, South Korea. It was 1948. So Mao consolidating China, 1949, made a Kirov visit. And in that Kirov visit, Moscow Kirov visit, he was admitted as a member of socialist state, approved diplomatically by Soviet Union. This is 1950, February 14, Moscow Kremlin signing contract, pact, diplomatic relation signing between Stalin, I believe, and Mao. So what is the great leap forward? This is a schematic picture. Soviet approach in Maoist approach, in contrast, in socialist development. So on the vertical axis, we try to picture production relations. On the horizontal axis, from subsistence affluence, productive forces. So productive forces means what? A lot of capital and labor from subsistence level, very low level, to affluence level. As we move, production relations fully socialized. At the beginning, it was like feudal society. Capitalist society could not fully socialize production relations. So capitalist state is at early stage, BC. And then when production relations are fully socialized, then B moves C to D. And here, communism ideal society is achieved with great affluence. This is kind of Soviet versus Maoist approach to socialist development, imagining highest fully socialized production relations by communism, affluence maximized. Then, what is Mao's great leap forward? In order to realize the goal of putting China in competition with the USSR for leadership of the international communist movement, the gradual development approach enshrined in the 1950s Constitution was discarded. So China ultimately was in competition with USSR to make hegemony international communist movement. So in 1954, they said Constitution was gradual development approaching like Soviet Union style. but that was discarded, gotten rid of, gave up. They gave up that gradual development approach in May 1958 at the 8th Communist Party Congress in Beijing. A new development strategy known as the Three Red Flag Strategy was announced. So this is rather radical revolution strategy. Three Red Flag Strategy was announced May 1958. The first red flag represents the new strategic line of socialist development, which is summed up by the slogan, go all out, aim high, achieve better and faster results. A very typical slogan, summing up. The second red flag stands out for the great leap forward. Great leap forward is what? As it stands, bigger leap, more strideful forward. In other words, push hard. The third flag represents the people's communes. It's not individual effort, people's communes effort. That means communist doctrine. It is not individual effort, communes effort. The gist of this strategy was to speed up socialist and economic development in China. Three red flag policy or whatever. Several policies implemented in the Great Leap Forward period were geared to achieve the rapid socialization and industrialization. This includes formation of people's communes, more collective farms, communes, the working on two legs policy, the introduction of active planning, a drastic increase in the rate of investment. That was pursued during Great Leap Forward. The first commune was formed in Henan in April 1958, and their formation spread like fire all over the country. With the encouragement of the great leader and the approval of Politburo of Chinese Communist Party. This is very monumental event. From Henan, April 1958, the first commune was spread like fire. By the year's end, 3,000 advanced agricultural cooperatives had been merged into 26,576 people's communes. From agricultural cooperatives into people's communes, and the rate of peasant participation had reached 99.1%. And to my judgment, this killed Chinese agriculture. People are not working unless there is their private incentives, farmers. Still, they had the incentive agricultural cooperative because if there are something left over, they can share. But as collectivized into more larger units of people's communes, there was nothing incentive. So they gave up working. In other words, this is the worst China's policy to make agricultural cooperatives into people's commune. They don't work in people's commune. With the establishment of the PC's, People's Commune, China's collectivization had gone well beyond the Soviet model in several respects. It was even harsher than Soviet model. See, the policy of working on one leg and following the Soviet model of industrialization using large-scale capital-intensive urban-based industries as the motor of development, aggravated. You see here, aggravated, made it worse. The magnitude of China's problems of unemployment in the cities. It also neglected the development of industries in China's rural areas and increased the rural-urban divide. To address these problems, the policy of working on two legs was introduced, which aimed at simultaneous development of both large-scale capital-intensive urban industries and small-scale labor-intensive rural industries. Two legs policy. On the one hand, capital-intensive large industries. On the other hand, small-scale labor-intensive rural industries. What happened? The Great Leap Forward, China's rate of investment and its allocation in the Great Leap Forward from 1953 to 1960. Rate of investment increased sharply. Share of industries, heavy industries increased sharply, but light industry went down. So Great Leap Forward made China more into heavy industry. Contrary to Mao's expectation, the Great Leap Forward failed to achieve the anticipated great improvements in industrial and agricultural development. The famine, this is critical. The famine resulting from the Great Leap Forward sowed the seeds for the Cultural Revolution. This is a very important sentence. The famine resulting from Great Leap Forward. You see, Great Leap Forward made the communes. They giving up a lot of automotive, agricultural crop that resulted in famine from Great Leap Forward. So the seeds for the Cultural Revolution. Cultural Revolution seed was planted. And as will be discussed, the backlash against it precipitated in initiation of China's economic reforms and the introduction of the open door policy after Mao's death. So outcome of the Great Leap Forward was great failure. Great Famine, 1959-61, was the result of both food availability decline and entitlement failure. Entitlement failure means, the establishment, the farmers' organization became useless. It used to be a strong, agricultural cooperative that became commune, and commune entitlement failure led. So the decline of food availability was triggered by the collapse of grain output, which was caused by mainly policy errors rather than bad weather. In an attempt to speed up both industrialization and socialization, unrealistic agricultural and industrial output targets had been set. To achieve these targets, huge amounts of rural labor had been diverted from agriculture to unsound rural irrigation, street making, and other rural industrial projects. Unnecessary, wasteful projects. So losing agricultural production power. The entitlement failure of rural population was caused by the inequitable distribution policy of staple foods. For while the urban populace was guaranteed its food grain ration, the rural communities were not. Urban populace was granted rural grain ration per kilogram per day. They were guaranteed. But rural communities were not guaranteed any grain ration. So they went to poverty. Rural cadres, for fear of being attacked as rightists, revisionists, tended to inflate local output targets, which necessarily led to a higher effective procurement ratio, despite a declining grain output, because they were feared. They were attacked by leftists as rightists, revisionists. So they inflated local output target. But at the end of the year, there was no local output target achieved. So as a result, after the fulfillment of procurement quota, very little was left in the hands of the farmers to feed themselves, and let alone for sowing and feeding their livestock. So Chinese farmers became in poverty, continuously poverty. State grain balance sheet from 1957 to 1962. Total supply, heavy industries declined. Share of industries sale to urban areas steadily increased. Sale to countryside declined. Supply to defense force stayed flat. Exports declined. Loss, therefore, reserve declined. So the great famine situation is making worse Chinese economy. National per capita food grain availability. For example, food grain availability, population, output, net exports, loss, changes in reserves, and food grain availability. If you see from 1957 to 1961, food grain availability is worsened declined. Per capita also declined, the last color. So it's a great famine situation in China by graph. This is worst famine situation in dark area. Official statistics of population and death rates. If you look at this, for example, 1960, when Great Leap Forward was at the height, rural death rate was 28%. National death rate was 25%. You can see here, Great Famine in 1960 China. Per capita food grain availability in China's cities and urban per capita grain availability steadily declined. From 1958 to 1961, even urban per capita grain availability declined as a consequence of food shortage. Rural per capita food grain availability was getting worse. Net procurement rate of agricultural output in the Great Leap Forward, you can see downward dying, slow down. Once from 25.2, 1960, to 15.3. Nominal and effective procurement ratio in Shandong province area. Grain output or procurement ratio actual went down from 21% to 18%. Shows great famine. Now, in the first phase of the Cultural Revolution, Red Guards were formed with the children of cadres and used to attack traditional Chinese culture, prominent cultural figures. During the second phase of Cultural Revolution, new groups of Red Guards known as rebel groups were formed, and their target was not traditional Chinese culture and its bearers, but party officials branded as capitalist rulers. So it became ideological war. From cultural, from simple farmers' revolution to cultural revolution. As more rebel groups were formed, the country in the third phase of Cultural Revolution descended into something resembling civil war with fractional fighting between rightists and leftists. During the Cultural Revolution, Mao rolled back most of the programmatic policies that had been adopted after the failure of Great Leap Forward. So Mao rolled back. Mao's radical policies were reinstated in agriculture. The practice of three freedoms and one guarantee was denounced, and the responsibility farm systems was banned again. Ownership of the means of production and income distribution decisions were again shifted to a higher collective level, with the transfer of basic accounting unit back to the level of the production brigade. In order to speed up industrial development, the transfer of resources to the agricultural sector was drastically cut back, and rural industries were made to rely once again on local resources and self-finance. Labor was again mobilized for the construction of rural infrastructure and irrigation projects, and moral incentives were emphasized again. Self-sufficiency in grain production and capital accumulation was pushed within the communes. The promotion of principle of self-reliance, which essentially implies the establishment of comprehensive independent economic system, not only in the nation, but at the region and local level as well, even down to that of the commune and individual enterprise. This policy had disastrous consequences for economic growth because it totally neglected the basic economic principles of comparative advantage, namely specialization and economies of scale. So this is the scene: Cultural Revolution in front of Tsinghua University main gate. I was there about, let me see, about 7 years ago. I was invited to attend Asia Clams conference at Tsinghua University as plenary session speaker. And it was very nice scene after restoring. But it was during Cultural Revolution. How terrible it is. Socialist modern economic growth, the outcome: rapid industrialization, modern economic growth, standard of living growth failed to match the growth of GDP, human development, income inequality, stratification. All these are socialist modern economic growth valuation, the outcome. But the outcome of 3 decades of socialist modernization under Mao was mixed at best. Economic change was impressive, for in this period, China achieved rapid industrialization and started modern economic growth. But these results were achieved at an enormous loss of human lives and output. A whole generation of China's rural population was sacrificed and driven to achieve ever higher production outputs without being given adequate resources, inputs, or material rewards. Their standard of living suffered badly. They were trapped in poverty and malnourishment. The results of Mao's social change agenda were equally mixed. On the one hand, China achieved excellent results in terms of human development, with a dramatic rise in population's longevity and literacy. On the other hand, Mao failed to create an egalitarian society. Though he succeeded in keeping the intertemporal, interpersonal income inequality in both rural and urban sectors low, he failed to narrow the urban-rural income gap. So still in China, urban-rural income gap is problematic. And though he dismantled the traditional class structure successfully, the stratification in socialist China was no less pronounced and rigid than it had been before. Vertical mobility was impossible for most people, even though it theoretically depended on little more than redness, that is, party loyalty. Since the major distribution mechanism was not the market, but worked through the allocation of rewards and privileges by work units, party cadres, it was clearly defined and strictly controlled by institutions. The opportunity structure for education was virtually frozen in their end through the Danwei and household registration system. Whatever opportunities for improving one's life chances were available were all located in small increments with great ideological power. Thus, while the stratification was less visible in Maoist China, it was definitely more pronounced and rigid than it had been before. And in substance, it was more akin to that of Tokugawa Japan than to a modern socialist society. So here is an international comparison of China's share of manufacturing in GDP. China 1981 became industrial power. Approaching upper middle income country. Heavy and machinery industry, China as high as Japan in 1965. So this is after Mao in the international comparison of share of heavy and machinery industry. Yes. China's economic growth rates exceeding all standards, approaching 6.1%. Growth of China's GDP and GDP per capita. GDP 4.4%, per capita GDP 2.3%. Comparative growth rates of GDP per capita, China versus East Asian countries. South Korea is 6.3%, China 2.3%, 52 1978. But after 1952-78, China impressive growth rate. Income inequality in China and South Asia. Of course, income inequality in China must be a lot better than other countries. China is Gini coefficient is lowest, 0.16. Highest, South Asia. Categories of Chinese workers. Urban permanent workers in state enterprise occupies most of their workers' time. This is a famous 1973 Mao with Kissinger, and Mao's death in 1976, intensive succession crisis, but Gang of Four, headed by Mao's wife, failed. Deng Xiaoping, third plenum meeting of the Central Committee, staged second stage of economic growth. So this is the Deng Xiaoping's story. China's long march towards a market economy started first stage, second stage, third stage. This is just a recent history you can read through. China's reform after Deng is nothing to be added. You can read through. This is a well-known story after Deng's reform. A few statistics. Growth rate, China 9.8%. GDP per capita 5.2%. Sources of economic growth, China's capital contribution of labor, TFP, you can mobilize growth accounting technique you learned in the Republic of Korea macroeconomic analysis. And projection of China's growth per capita income ranging 2030 is listed here. So China's One Belt, One Road policy initiative, but this is a history right now because of Sino-China and US conflict. China's One Belt initiative is into trouble. And I listed several recent footsteps of China's policy, and including China-US trade war during the coronavirus period. Okay, so that is the history of China under Maoism, modern history. Even though we do not have enough time, I will take a 5-minute break and then start reviewing introductory part of Japan's. Okay, take a look at. So let's stop for 5 minutes. 날이 더워서 그런지 힘든다. 읽기만 해도 힘들어. 여름이 왔어. 상황. 거기 다 만든 거 있는데 꺼버리고 밑에 실질 꺼버리고 그쪽으로 날씨가 장난이 아니네. 내가 오늘 한 그 마오이즘 그게 긴 챕터야. 내용 자체가 길어. 그럴 수밖에 없는 게 마오 시대하고 최근 것까지 하고 다 해야 돼. 공유되고 있나? 응?
네, 되고 있습니다.
공유되고 있어? Okay, thank you for waiting. Even though we do not have enough time to cover this lecture one of modern Japanese economic growth, we'll just take an introduction and be ready for next week's main coverage of Japanese economy. We begin with a very rough economic history of Japan. First, context with Europe, 16th century. Renaissance Europeans were quite admiring of Japan. Japan was considered a country immensely rich in precious metals, gilded temples and palaces, relative abundance of surface ores, characteristic of a volcanic country. Japan was a major exporter of copper and silver during the 16th century. Japan was also perceived as a sophisticated feudal society with high culture and advanced pre-industrial technology, densely populated and urbanized, high quality of Japanese craftsmanship and metal smithing. Japan is rather poor in natural resources found commonly in Europe, especially iron. Thus, the Japanese were famously frugal with their consumable resources. What little they had, they used with expert skill. This is a small samurai Tasekura in Rome, 1615. Portuguese who were called Nanban, southern barbarians. The meaning of Nanban is southern barbarians, were intermediaries in Asian trade. Because Japanese had been prohibited from any contact with the Emperor of China. As a punishment for Wako pirate raids, Portuguese ships with Chinese goods were very much welcomed in Japan. From time of the acquisition of Macau in 1557 and their formal recognition as trade partners by the Chinese, Portuguese started to regulate trade to Japan by selling to the highest bidder the annual captaincy to Japan, in effect conferring exclusive trading rights for a single carrack bound for Japan every year. However, Portuguese trade was progressively more and more challenged by smugglers. Chinese smugglers on junks and Japanese Red Seal ships from around 1592, Spanish ships from Manila from around 1600, the Dutch from 1609, and the English from 1613. The Dutch, who were called Como, literally meaning red hair, first arrived in Japan in 1600. The Dutch also engaged in piracy and naval combat to weaken Portuguese and Spanish shipping in the Pacific, and ultimately became the only Westerner to be allowed access to Japan from the small enclave of Dejima after 1638 and for the next 2 centuries. So Dutch dominated the trade with Japan. So this is Portuguese Carrack in Nagasaki, 17th century. Economic development during the Edo period. Urbanization started during the Edo period. Increased shipping of commodities, a significant expansion of domestic and foreign commerce, a diffusion of trade and handicraft industry. The construction trade flourished along with banking facility and merchant association. Increasingly, Han authorities oversaw the rising agricultural production and spread of rural handicrafts. By the mid-18th century, Edo and other castle towns grew in the size of population and trade. Osaka and Kyoto became busy trading and handicraft production centers, while Edo was the center for supply of food and essential urban consumables. Rice was the base of the economy, as the daimyo collected the taxes from the peasants in the form of rice. Taxes were high, about 40% of the harvest. To raise money, the daimyo used forward contracts to sell rice that was not yet harvested. These contracts were similar to modern future trading. The beginning of the Edo period coincides with the last decades of Nanban trade period, during which intense interaction with European powers on the economic and religious plane took place. At the beginning of the Edo period, Japan built their first ocean-going Western-style warship. This is very seminal event. At the beginning of the Edo period, Japan built her first ocean-going Western-style warships. In order to eradicate the influence of Christianization, Japan entered in a period of isolation called Sakoku, during which its economy enjoyed stability and mild progress. But not long after, in the 1650s, production of Japanese export porcelain increased greatly when civil war put the main Chinese center of porcelain production. For the rest of the 17th century, most Japanese porcelain production was in Kyushu area for export through the Chinese and Dutch. The trade dwindled under renewed Chinese competition by the 1740s, before resuming after the opening of Japan in the mid-19th century. During the Edo period, Japan progressively studied Western sciences and techniques through the information and books received through the Dutch traders in Dejima. The main areas that were studied included geography, medicine, natural sciences, astronomy, art, language, physical science, electrical from mechanical science, Japanese clock, watches, or wadoke, inspired from Western techniques. This is wadoke. Beautiful, isn't it? After 1854, when the Tokugawa shogunate first opened the country to Western economic influence, Japan went through two periods of economic development. When the Tokugawa shogunate was overthrown and the Meiji government was founded, Japanese westernization began completely. First term, pre-war Japan. Second term, post-war Japan. So in the first half of the Meiji period, most labor disputes occurred in the mining and textile industry. The second half of the period, rapid industrialization. The use of strike action increased 1897, and modern Japanese trade union movement began. So Meiji period means end of the feudal system. Japanese people now had the ability to become more educated, implementing the Western ideal of capitalism into the development of technology, and Japan into both a militaristically and the economic powerhouse. Western-based education system for all young people sent thousands of students to US and Europe, hired more than 3,000 Westerners to teach modern science. The government also built railroads, improved roads, land reform, and so forth. To promote industrialization, the private sector was best equipped to stimulate economic growth. Many of these businesses grew rapidly into the large conglomerates. Government emerged as chief promoter of private enterprise. So early 20th century, Mr. Han, we will restart from here. Okay, so it's a slide 90, early 20th century. Okay, to refresh our memory. Okay. So thank you for all of you. There was a very brief introduction to Japanese economy, but we will continue from slide 19 of this slide next week. Thank you for your understanding.